My name is Tom Rosch, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to talk with my good friend and longtime colleague, Ed Rockefeller, today about his career and his life. As I say, it's a tremendous pleasure for me. Ed?
Tom, I'm flattered by the invitation and very pleased to be with you on any occasion at all.
Well, that's great. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, Ed. I want to talk a little bit first about Ed, the individual, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about Ed, the antitrust practitioner, and then Ed, the leader. He's been, for those of you who have been out of touch, Ed was both the chairman of the antitrust section and is currently and has long time been the head of the BNA Antitrust and Trade Regulation Reporter Advisory Board. And then finally I want to talk about Ed, the author, which is I think his latest endeavor. But let me start at the beginning, Ed, if I can, and ask you a few biographical questions. First of all, where were you born and when were you born?
I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1927, I'm told.
Okay. And what did your parents do? How did they happen to be in Harrisburg?
I think my mother's family had been there for generations, and my father's also. I think he was a broker at that time, and at that time, women's place was in the home.
Mm-hmm. Did you have siblings?
One sister, 6 years younger.
Is she still living, or is...
Yes, she is.
And where does she live?
She lives in Ridgefield, Connecticut.
Oh, okay. And then you went away from Harrisburg to college and law school.
My father continually moved south. He moved from Harrisburg to Philadelphia. Then I went away to school and was never lived at home after that. He continued on to near Baltimore and then to Florida and then to Jamaica. You
went to Yale. Right,
I did.
To Yale College?
Yes.
And Yale Law School?
Correct.
Why? I mean,
I don't know. I went to Yale College, I think, because I always liked the color blue. And I think that's the only college I may have heard of at that time. There was no other reason. Nobody in my family went there, or nobody from the school I went to went there. The law school I went to because a man that I knew in college said, let's go over and sign up for a room. So we did.
Well, you had a lot of luminaries in that law school class, as I recall, or at least maybe they're not luminaries, but at least they're people that I know. Can you name a couple of them?
Well, I think the people that may have become most apparent to the general public were Patricia McGowan Wald, who was the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Another man, Burke Marshall, was John Kennedy's first Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and remained after that I think an important advisor to Senator Edward Kennedy. The rest of them I don't think of as being particularly luminaries.
Well, Jody was in your class, wasn't she?
Jody
Bernstein.
Zeldis Bernstein was in my class and a very good dancer.
Yeah, I'll bet she was. She's always been
always
a live
lot
wire.
Of fun, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Arthur Albrecht from the West Coast was in your class
was
as well?
My class.
He happened to be a partner in a law firm that I joined very early on. Arthur was a good guy. What caused you to be interested in the law? When did you get interested in it?
I've tried to think back on that. I think my father had a friend in Harrisburg who was a district attorney. And I must have got the idea from that it was a good idea to be a lawyer. And so I never wanted to be anything else until my first year in law school. Then I decided I never wanted to be a lawyer. Law school was very disappointing to me, and I almost quit. I'm so glad I didn't. And the only thing I thought was, well, I've started this, I ought to finish it.
Did you live in the dorm at that time? Or
we lived in very nice little suites. first in the law buildings, and then they had something called freshman counselors at Yale. Another man and I had a dozen and a half college freshmen to counsel, and then we were provided a place to live.
Did you major in any particular area, either in college or law school?
In college, it was political science, government. In law school, I'd say the answer is no. There was more required subjects then, although I think the first year was the only year subjects were required, but I didn't specialize in anything particularly.
When did you graduate from law school?
1951.
Okay. And then what did you do?
Then I went to Central Intelligence Agency. I had been a draft dodger all my life, before it was fashionable. And I was either deferred as a student. Well, first of all, I was in the Merchant Marine toward the end of the Second World War. So that didn't provide me any military service record. So I was deferred through school, and then it was either be drafted or dodge again. So at that time, I thought we would have a major war with the Soviet Union, and I spent my third year in law school most of the time studying Russian. And I had enough Russian that by the summer of 1951, a Central Intelligence Agency gave me a job.
And where were they located at that time?
Well, the agency was in Washington. They then sent me to Frankfurt, Germany.
For how long? I mean, how long were you with the CIA?
Just 2 years in Frankfurt.
Was that the standard enlistment period?
No. The assumption was that you'd stay there all your life, but there again, after about a year or so, I looked at the people 30 years older than I was and said, this is not where I want to be 30 years from now. Mm-hmm. So in Frankfurt, there was a Corps headquarters of the U.S. Army, and I was able to put in papers there to get a commission in the Army, a Judge Advocate General's Corps.
And how long were you with JAG?
3 years.
Until when was that?
53 to 56.
Okay.
In Stuttgart.
Were there some highlights of that period, CIA and the Army, that you think are worth mentioning?
Well, the CIA thing was pretty completely discouraging. That is, I believed we had a worthwhile project, which was to upset Stalin. But we didn't really know what we were doing, and all it did was get some people killed. I was never in any physical danger, so don't feel sorry for me about that. The Army was a wonderful experience. There again, for about a year and a half, it was just fascinating. I must have had 200 general courts-martial, and at that time, our forces and any people accompanying them were not subject to any German criminal courts. So our general, the commanding general of 7th Army, had 45,000 troops subject to his court-martial jurisdiction, and out of 45,000 men, you get all kinds of unacceptable behavior. Mm-hmm. And I prosecuted and defended such cases. The majority were larceny and aggravated assaults. I prosecuted cases involving knives, pool cues, razors, any tire chains, anything you can think of that you would assault somebody else with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that was very entertaining, but I knew from the start I didn't want to stay with that for life.
Right. Now, you got married, however, over there, didn't you?
In 1952 in Frankfurt, Germany, the same place the Holy Roman Emperors were crowned.
Okay. And who did you marry?
A woman named Marilee Wallace from Boston.
But she had a nickname, didn't she?
Mousie, she was called, from her childhood days.
Okay. And how long were you guys married?
From 1952 until 3 years ago last August when she died.
Okay. And that would have been over 50 years then.
Yes.
Well, that's quite remarkable.
It was a very lucky break for me.
Absolutely. Now, did you have children?
2.
And
Boys.
Who were they, and where are they now?
Well, Ben, they were born in 1958 and 1960. Ben, the older one, lives in Brussels, not married. The younger one lives near Philadelphia. He's married and has 3 children.
Okay, so you have 3 grandchildren at this
Correct.
point. And are they boys or girls?
1 boy and 2 girls.
Okay, and how old is the oldest one, and how old is the youngest one?
5, 3, and 9 months.
Well, if they're in Philadelphia, I imagine you see them from time to time,
Yes.
too. It's great to be a grandparent, isn't it?
It is.
You don't have the responsibilities, but you got the fun.
That's what they all say.
Right. Okay, now then let's go on forward from there. And where'd you end up after Stuttgart?
I came back to Washington. My wife and I wanted to live in Washington. It's where we'd met, and we thought it was the most interesting place in the world.
But you'd never lived there before, right?
Briefly, when I first was hired by Central Intelligence Agency. Mm-hmm. So it was the only place we wanted to come back to. So I tried to get a job with a law firm. I had the romantic idea you'd be with a nice small law firm, it'd be fine, and none of them would hire me. So I got a job at the Federal Trade Commission.
Okay, that's near and dear to my heart. What did you do there?
I was in the compliance division. They called it the compliance division of the General Counsel's office. And they were making a survey of old orders. They had issued these orders, hundreds or thousands of them, and nobody ever checked up on whether anybody was complying with them or they were dead or what happened to them. So they had a systematic going through of these orders, and they had attorneys assigned to that. We'd write to people and get reports. But that was in the compliance division, but the man who really hired me was a man named Earl Kitner, who was the chairman. And I wrote speeches for him, and when his immediate assistant left, he took me into his office.
Okay.
And then he became the chairman, and we both moved into the chairman's office.
Well, let me see if I've got this straight. Now, you were in compliance division for how long of OGC?
Well, I went there in the fall of '56, and I don't know just when it was that I moved in as assistant to the general counsel, but it was in 1960, I think, that when the chairman of the FTC left, and it was at the end of the Eisenhower administration, and Kentner managed to get himself appointed chairman. Okay,
but Earl Kentner was the general counsel.
Correct.
When you first went there.
He moved from general counsel to the chairman.
Okay. And what was your position when you were his assistant?
He told me I could have any title I wanted so long as it wasn't chairman, because he was going to be the chairman.
Okay.
So I said, okay, I'll be executive assistant to the chairman.
Okay. That's now, I guess, what one would call the chief of staff at the commission.
I don't
Is that
know
right?
what you call it now.
Okay. Well, I think it is, actually.
It's
a little better title, actually.
I thought it was a good title.
Yeah. And your duties there were pretty much to write speeches for him? Or
No. I assisted him in any way he needed assistance. Mm-hmm. He made a lot of speeches, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. Mm-hmm. But also, the chairman would participate in formal matters, and I would assist him in those. Or, some little things around the building if he wanted done. He'd do it through me.
Okay, and how long were you there in that position?
I think that was less than a year, because then John Kennedy got elected, and Mr. Kentner had the crazy idea that he might be held over, but he wasn't. So we left.
Who replaced him? I've forgotten. I don't remember who was the
Isn't
next.
that awful? At the moment, it was Rand Dixon.
Oh, okay.
Paul Rand Dixon from Tennessee.
Quite a character.
Senator Kefauver's man.
Absolutely. Okay. And then what did you do?
Well, Earl Kitner went with a law firm, and he invited me to go with him, and I went with him. And after about 6 months, I decided...
that was Arendt, Fox, and Kentner?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I decided it's better to be in law practice for yourself.
And how did you make that decision? Because it strikes me as very courageous. I've never been able to do something like that.
Well, a couple of my classmates, Carl Harkrader and Bob Wald, they were starting up, so they said, would I like to come with them? And I said, yes, I would.
Okay. And so it was, what was the name of that firm?
That was called Wald, Harkrader, and Rockefeller.
Okay, and how many people were in at the beginning, if you
Well, there were 3 at the beginning. In fact, we had to take turns sitting at the desk. But somehow we survived. That was very exciting for me.
Did you build it out then, over time?
Well, Wald was always interested in building out like crazy, and I always said that he was afraid if we made any money, he wouldn't have enough people to share it with. So he was constantly hiring people, but after 6 or 8 years, I decided I didn't like the future there. Mm-hmm. And so I left.
And
he went on to build the firm up to 150, 175 lawyers, and then later collapsed completely.
Okay. And what was the next firm? I mean,
then I got together with a man named Jim Bierbauer, who was one of the finest men I've ever met. He was completely independent, and the philosophy there was if we got any federal trade or antitrust matters, I'd handle them, and he'd handle everything else. And he could.
What was that practice?
But we really just shared offices.
What was that practice like? I mean,
it was just great, because there was plenty of FTC business then.
What sort of business was it? Was it competition?
I don't know, they'd
or
investigate people, or they would harass merger candidates, or whatever they did. But they came after General Motors for monopolizing its own parts. They had Robinson-Patman matters.
And what did Mr. Bierbauer do? What was
everything else? He was Jeb Magruder's lawyer. He knew about Watergate before it was in the newspapers.
My gosh. So how long were you at Bierbauer and Rockefeller?
That was another 9 or 10 years.
Which brings us up to about when? If it's during...
I think of these as 10-year periods, so 60 to 70, 70 to 80. Yeah, I'm around 1980 or so.
Okay.
Then with the Reagan Revolution and the change in the legal profession and the population of lawyers, my practice was declining. Mm-hmm. And at one time I had 4 associates working for me, 3 secretaries and 2 paralegals. But as business declined, I couldn't bring myself to fire them. And 1 or 2 found other positions. But I then managed to pass us all off on another law firm. Mm-hmm. And they fired them.
Which law firm was that?
That was Schiff, Harden, and Waite.
Chicago-based, as I recall.
Yes, it was.
And that was when did you start there, and when did you end up leaving?
Well, it was
firm?
another 20 years. I think, if I've got it right. There was a great guy named Don McSweeney. He'd been
mm-hmm.
active, and you probably know him,
mm-hmm.
in the antitrust section. And it was through him that I hooked up with them. I was never really a partner. It was just they took some of my billings to provide me office space.
And what sort of work were you doing there at Schiff Harden?
I have trouble remembering now which things happened when, but it was continually declining then, and there was more. One case involved a consumer protection matter went on for a long time.
Well, as I recall,
I think the General Motors case. I'm not sure when that concluded.
I think you and I worked on a number of matters together.
You sent me clients, yes.
And I can't remember exactly what they were, but they were they were big cases, as I recall, and I think you handled the FTC side of it, and I kind of handled the private side.
There was one very entertaining thing at the Maritime Commission, as I recall, that involved a Japanese firm.
Yeah.
And, of course, none of the Maritime Commission people could make any sense out of the client's records, and that went on for a while, but with no resolution.
That's a lot of fun. And
yeah, it was.
Absolutely. Well, now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what happened after Schiff Hardin. Was there, did you practice antitrust law at all after Schiff Hardin?
Well, I took everything I could get, and it was mostly FTC matters.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But you were very active in the antitrust section, as I recall. When did that start?
From the 1950s. My boss, Earl Kentner, had been very active in Bar Association matters, and he made himself president of the Federal Bar Association, and he encouraged, or at least by imitation, I joined all the bar associations. I went to every ABA meeting from 1959 to 1979, I think, or longer, maybe 89. And so I discarded some of them as I went along, but I stayed with the section of antitrust law, and it was a big opportunity for me.
I remember looking at the at some of the dinner invitations, or not invitations, but the menus of the antitrust section during that period, and they listed at that time all of the officers and counsel and committee chairs and vice chairs and subcommittee chairs, etc. And it looked like a huge number of chairs to climb up through. Was that the way it struck you at the time? And how long did it take you to go up through those chairs?
As I recall, what happened was Tommy Austern was on the BNA Antitrust Advisory Board, a lawyer in Washington. And I had been chairman. They called me coordinator when we started in 1961. So Mr. Austern, at one point, asked me to be the spring dinner chairman, because we were both in Washington. And he did all the work, set me up at the head table, and then gave me all the credit. So I think in a way that helped me somehow be more visible than the rest of the people that you refer to. Then I think it was after that they made me chairman of the Legislation Committee. And at that time, the job of the Legislation Committee chairman was to have lunch from time to time with a man named Jerry Cohen, who was Senator Hart's counsel at the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee. And he would tell me what they were doing, or, you know, nothing secret, but then I would pass that on in reports. And the next thing, that then got me to be one of the council members. And then it was like a little club in those days. That is, there were, you refer to all these offices and so on, but one good burst of machine gun fire at one of the meetings would have killed off the section of antitrust law. They had thousands of people on a mailing list, but there were only 40 or 50 people who took any active role. So somehow I was able, when it came to the end of my term for the council, they put me on the ladder to be the chairman.
And what officership did you hold first, and how did you move up through those chairs?
I can't remember those precisely. It was a pretty short ladder. And that is, I can't remember being the treasurer or anything. You know, maybe I was. The vice chairman was always used as a way to just park somebody or get rid of them. But somehow it was pretty clear when I think I was selected as chairman when my council term ran out.
Do you recall when you were chairman? I remember distinctly you being the chairman, but I don't recall the date. Does that ring bells with you?
I think it was 77, 78, thereabouts. It might be in that little biography in the back of my book.
Okay. I've read the book, by the way, and we'll get to that. I don't recall that particular fact being in the book. But let me ask you another question, because I do recall that the section at that time had some pretty terrific meetings. Apart from the spring meeting, there was a midwinter meeting, and where was that held? Do you recall where your midwinter meeting was?
I think when I was chairman, we went to New Orleans because I liked New Orleans. We had, I can recall, an annual meeting. The man that preceded me was a man named Brian Dillon from Houston, Texas, and he had some heart health problems, and he was unable to come to the annual meeting that one year, so I had to take over there. That was in Atlanta.
I seem to recall that. And the New Orleans one I recall because I think they had kind of a Mardi Gras theme there at that meeting.
I can't remember, Tom.
It was a pretty spectacular meeting, as I recall. But the ones I really recall had vividly were the meetings of the BNA advisory board, because you invited me to become a member of the advisory board, I think in 1976. I believe that was when it was. And I think you've mentioned before that you had been the presiding officer at the advisory board before that. Now, can you sort of track us through that period of time, too?
That was another of the very lucky things that happened to me. When Kennedy got elected, and so that was the end at the Federal Trade Commission. I could have stayed there in the ranks, but with the opportunity to leave, I did. And at the same time, BNA came to me and said, we would like to organize a weekly report on antitrust and trade regulation. What do you think? And I said, I thought that'd be wonderful. So the concept was they'd have an advisory board. They would invite people who were conspicuous in the field, and they called me coordinator. So I would chair the meetings, discussion meetings. And at that time, maybe 8 or 10 a year. And I'd take notes, and then I would try to write analysis pieces, and they would print some of those. I think it was 5 or 6 years later, or maybe 10, that they called me chairman. When we started, I was the youngest guy in the room. Now I'm the oldest.
Well, there were some pretty important people in that room in the antitrust world, at least as I recall it. Who are the people that stand out in your mind?
Well, I think the primary two would be Philippa, Rita, and Robert Bork. I think Philippa, Rita was so articulate and so knowledgeable, and Robert Bork was more imaginative and has been, I consider, had more influence in antitrust than Rita did or anybody else.
There were some other people, as I recall, that were standouts. Phil Ellman was on for a while, wasn't he?
We would try to have some balance of plaintiff and defendant, although it's tough to get plaintiffs' lawyers.
You did have some, though.
We would try to aim for balance of corporate lawyers and private practitioners. And we were particularly interested in former high government officials, especially if they weren't in Washington. So we always try to avoid being too Washington-centered, or at least to try to get the perspective of people outside the city.
Right. Who were some of the plaintiffs' lawyers? Now, Jerry Cohen was on for a while.
Jerry Cohen, yes. He was a standout. One of the earlier ones was Dave Berger from Philadelphia.
Berger and Montag.
Very prickly guy. But he mellowed after he made so much money. Lloyd Constantine was with us for a time, and he's made more money than anybody, and he promised me he wouldn't mellow.
Has he kept that promise?
It's hard to get plaintiffs' lawyers because they're either so busy or so rich they don't have any interest.
Well, that's probably true. That said, there were some people who were pretty doggone good authors in the area at that time. Fred Rowe had authored a prominent Robinson-Patman Act treatise, as I recall.
He wrote a book called Price Discrimination, which I think pretty much destroyed the Robinson-Patman Act.
Yeah, I think it did too.
Intellectually.
Yeah. Tommy Ostern was also a member of the advisory board.
Yes, he was for many years.
And
from the original date. Tommy actually had been invited for the first meeting. And he came, and here I am, this kid, trying to chair this meeting, and Tommy said with great confidence in his voice that you're making a mistake to create this report. You're just going to misinform a lot of people, and you really shouldn't do it. And I don't want to have anything to do with it. So I thought, gee, this little project that I've got for myself is going up in smoke. But we went on, and 6 months later, he came back to the BNA management and said, I'd like to be on the board. I said, tell them we don't need them. They said, you don't understand, Ed, we're running this to make friends, not enemies. We need them. So he came back. And he was very difficult for a number of years. This was prior to the time that as I say, he started me in the section of antitrust law, really. There was one meeting, he would come and say any subject at all. He'd say, I can't really talk about this because my firm is handling it. And then he would proceed to, give us a 20-minute lecture on the whole subject. So some of the members of the board said, we think you ought to clamp down on some people and give us a chance to talk. So at one point, he spoke for a while, and then I recognized somebody else, and then he wanted to start talking again, and I said, well, no, we're going to hear from Mr. So-and-so now. So he got up and walked toward the door and said, well, if you don't want to hear from me, and fortunately I was quick enough to say, it's not that we don't want to hear from you, but we want to hear from other people too. He came back, he sat down, and he was the best friend I ever had for the rest of my life.
That's a great story.
If you let him push you around, you weren't going anywhere.
Yeah, right.
But if you stood up for yourself, he was a great friend.
Well, by and large, you didn't have any trouble with people not speaking up in those meetings.
No,
though.
although I always worry, and to this day, half the time I worry that people will talk too much, and the other time that they won't talk enough.
Well, I can understand that. Let me switch gears now and talk about your publications, and particularly about your most recent book. First of all, I'm interested in the mechanics, so I want to talk about that, and then we'll talk about the substance. But before we get to that, this is not your only publication. You had published some other things before this, and what were they?
They were all nothing books that aren't worth talking about.
Well, one of them
They were books simply for advertising. They were repeating things that other people said. And I'm not ashamed of them, but I have no pride in them.
Well, the desk book on practice at the FTC, I think, was kind of the handbook for FTC practice for many years.
If it was useful to people, I'm glad. The purpose of it was to promote me.
Well, it was both. It did both. Let me put it that way. I think that's great. Now, that then, however, brings us to your current book, which just hit the bookshelves about 6 months or so ago, didn't it? I think maybe
it was available a year ago, but yeah, 6 months.
Okay. Let me ask you, first of all, when you started that project.
Well, I pretty much retired from law practice in 2000 or 2001, but I continued the BNA connection. So I was going to these meetings and keeping in touch with developments. and continuing to think about the subject. And I would write some little analysis pieces, which nobody cared about except me, but it gave me a chance to think about and comment on developments. And I got my thoughts more...
These were the ones that you put in the BNA.
They call them viewpoint.
Yes.
I got my thoughts sort of more and more organized and more critical, or more and more outside having to expound doctrines and thinking about, do they make any sense? And fortunately, there was a man named Robert Levy at Cato that I invited to one of the BNA board meetings, and we asked him to join, but he had other interests. But at one point I sent him a little outline of a book about antitrust. And he gave me some critical thoughts on it, and I revised the outline, and then I started sending him draft chapters, which he edited for, not necessarily for grammar and syntax, but I wanted somebody who knew something about the field but would look it over critically. And he did that. And then Cato published it. Now, what happened was, I think that people in the field are unable to think about it. They are busy, and I try to explain this in the book, they are busy doing what they can to attract clients, performing for the clients, trying to influence decisions properly of bureaucrats and judges, and they can't go in and say, this doesn't make any sense. They've got to go in and pretend it does make sense. But once I was freed of law practice, I could think in a way that most people in the field can't. Not that I'm all that smart, but I was out from under that inhibition. Mm-hmm. So I got the case books at the major law schools. I got a Rita's book. I got the one that Bob Potofsky uses. And I looked at what they said about different things and made notes and compared them. And so I thought, and I came up with the thesis of this book, that antitrust is sort of like a religion. It's a collection of beliefs, assumptions, predictions, independent of the statutes. The statutes, the wording of the statutes, don't determine the beliefs of the religion. And I try to explain all that.
Well, it's a very thought-provoking book. There's no question about that. You finished it when?
Well, maybe a year or two before it was published. I mean, it takes about a year of their final editing and preparation.
So you finished it in roughly 2006 or so?
Yeah,
roughly
I think so, 6 or 7.
And when did you start it? Again,
3 or 4 years before.
I'm talking really about when you put pen to paper to start it.
Well, I did it on the computer, and I did these chapters that I would send to Bob Levy over a period of 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
There was no deadline. There was no. Needed something to do, and that's what I did.
Okay. Now you had started. I think you said that you basically started this project a little bit after you retired from the practice of law at Schiff Hardin, which was back in roughly 2000 or so.
2000 or 2001, and I didn't say it myself at that time. I'm going to write a book about antitrust.
You just decided.
I just started doing the thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And writing these little pieces about various segments, which I was never able to use word for word, but they were my thoughts on, say, mergers or monopolization or the antitrust community.
Now, how?
Or what is antitrust?
Right. Now, how did you do this? I mean, what was the discipline you used to write this book? Because I know there are a lot of would-be authors out in our community, and there are very few who have the discipline to do it. Did you spend a couple of hours each day on this project,
no.
or what?
I just did it when it interested me.
Okay.
And I suppose it was discipline in a way that I had the attention of Bob Levy, so I wanted to keep sending him material so he wouldn't lose interest. That was the only discipline.
Okay. Now,
And it was not something that I had to force myself to do, because what I was doing was thinking about and writing or saying things that I wanted to say.
and then when you put these down on paper, you would send them to Mr. Levy? Is that what
Chapter
happened?
at a time.
Okay. And there's a lot of footnotes in this book.
It's a lot of work.
Who did that work?
Oh, I did that.
You did that work?
Sure.
Okay.
Who else?
Which, I don't know.
Don't be impressed by them. The footnotes don't. The value of the book is in the text, if any, and whether it makes sense or not. And the footnotes they're just proof to the reader that I didn't make this up.
Well, I agree with that, but I looked to the footnotes because I think the footnotes are very interesting.
Are you cited in there?
I looked about that too, and I'm not. And I'm frankly at this juncture, I don't know whether I should rejoice or be in despair about it. I don't know, Ed. But in any event, I'm not. But I do think the footnotes are very rich. I mean, they indicate that you really did give a lot of thought to this subject matter.
They resulted from my reading, making notes, collecting newspaper articles over a period of several years. And I somehow was able then to draw on those when I wanted to say something.
Do you mind if I take the book for a second and quote a couple of passages from it, and then you can tell me how you came to these conclusions. The book's thesis, it says, will be developed first by defining antitrust as a religious faith with an existence independent of antitrust statutes. I'm interested in how you came to analogize this to a religious faith.
Well, what started me, I don't know this is a precise answer to that question, but what started my thinking on that was looking at Rita's book. And I found a paragraph, which I quote in there, in which he talks about antitrust law, and in a confusing way. And I try to analyze that in the book, that I could see there, he seemed confused, or he did not separate antitrust law, and the antitrust statutes. And I think if you want to think sensibly about the subject and talk sensibly about the subject, you have to distinguish between those. And he was not doing so. That's why you get newspaper articles that talk about antitrust concerns. And you ask yourself, what are they talking about? I think what they're talking about is some sort of belief in certain things. And then I asked, well, what are those beliefs? The first one, it seems to me, is the Standard Oil legend. Most people in the United States that have any notion of it believe in it, and certainly most antitrust lawyers do. The legend being that Standard Oil monopolized oil in the United States, that the government broke up Standard Oil, and it was a good thing for us all that it did, and that was, at least symbolically, the original trust. That's what we're anti in antitrust. Now, from what I've read, the Standard Oil legend is not true. Prices were continually going down during all the period that Standard Oil was prosecuted for. Breaking it up did no good. Even Theodore Roosevelt said that. So did, I'm not sure about Thurman Arnold, but Roosevelt himself said accomplished nothing. Just hurt a lot of little people. So here you have a tradition of simply turning on winners based on false history. And then we've got the monopolization notion out of all that. And even to this day now, people are still struggling to try to pretend that there's any difference between competing and doing something you shouldn't.
I think you're correct about that. That's reflected in the Antitrust Division's recent report, as a matter of fact. Now, you go on to say that Chapter 2 describes the development of a cult of professional followers who serve as a priesthood to carry out the ceremonial function of antitrust. And can you tell us what you're referring to there and what your thesis is there?
Well, I first noticed at one of these BNA advisory board meetings, I'm sure it wasn't the first time I heard it, but I remember it was when it first registered on me, people talking about the antitrust community. So I'm saying to myself, what's the antitrust community? Well, I think it's the people that busy themselves with the subject. And they have their own activities. They organized a section of the American Bar Association, and they publish things, and that's the community.
And that's the priesthood you're talking about here?
They carry out the proceedings, yes. Mm-hmm. And as I see so-called law enforcement proceedings in antitrust are just ceremonial. Thurman Arnold said that. I quote him early there, that they are a ceremony celebrating a belief in antitrust. Mm-hmm. And the community conducts these ceremonies.
Okay. You say here that market power is a central element of antitrust faith, but that is an imaginary, hypothetical concept borrowed from economic theory and used by the antitrust community as though it describes something that actually exists, when in fact the concept of market power is based on false assumptions about a future that cannot be known. Can you tell me what you mean by that and when you first came to that conclusion?
Well, it must have been sometime between 2001 and 2006. That's the portion of the book that I'm most eager to have some knowledgeable criticism of, and I'm still waiting. Because that is something I don't think you can read anywhere else. The way it strikes me is market power is a theoretical construct. It's also obvious, but somehow most other people see it differently. First, you have to define a market by assumptions. Those assumptions have to be based on assumptions about the future, which can't be known, and including assumptions that an assumption that things won't change, which we know is not true. And then once you get through that process of theoretical constructing, then you go through another one to construct market power. So it seems to me it can't be a matter of factual proof, and does not provide, as Fred Rowe says, and I quote him at length, I think he's the most insightful of any of the people I've known. The market is just a metaphor. There is no market. And so all this talk about market power is simply laid on as a rationalization for taking some action that the decider wants to take. And I say that's what's happening, and that's not the rule of law, because there is no rule that's discoverable.
Well, I should remark at this point that you're not the first person to say this. I remember Ira Milstein saying this shortly after G.T. Sylvania was decided at a meeting that was held up in New York. So the whole notion of market power being the crux of antitrust is something that has been criticized before.
Well, Ira left the field altogether. I think he got bored with it.
I'm not sure about that, but you're right, he did leave it. Let me ask you, Ed, if you have any other, if I can use the word disciples, are there any other people who share your views, the kind of views that are expressed in this book?
Not that I know of, and I'm not looking for them. Mm-hmm. What I want is criticism. I want people to tell me what's wrong with what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. The ideas interest me. And since I'm no longer in law practice, there's no mileage for me, and I don't get any royalties from the book.
I can understand both points, I think. Let me just, if I may, hold up your book here so that everybody will take a look at it. It is entitled The Antitrust Religion, and there's a subtitle that says How Blind Faith in Antitrust Has Led to Confusing and Arbitrary Enforcement by Edwin S. Rockefeller. It is if I may say so, my friend, as I said before, a thought-provoking book, but it's also a sobering book for all of those who've spent our entire careers in the antitrust community. But I think it's something that people should read.
It may be a little ungracious of me to have profited so from the whole field and now turn on it. But as I say, it's the ideas that interest me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you, Tom.
It's been a great pleasure.
I enjoyed it.
Absolutely.